I do a fair bit of media analysis here on this channel, and I've often talked about Orientalism in regards to like contemporary films, depictions of people from like the Middle East or Asia. I've talked about like cyberpunk as a genre being very problematic in this regard, but something I guess I haven't spoken about too much is the depiction of Native Americans, Indigenous people, in Hollywood films. Now, of course, this has a very long history of being very problematic, and the depiction of native peoples often just being used to further really harmful stereotypes about them. It's quite similar to how African Americans were often used in films as well. And this brings me to the film Twilight. Now, you guys might think Twilight, that is an old series kind of now. It's been over for years and years, but I actually saw stuff recently about it pop up on my social media feed, and there's been a bit of like drama about the author of the books because they released the Twilight saga from Edward Cullen's perspective last year, and then she gave interviews recently, and the director of the films was saying how she wouldn't make the vampires more diverse and stuff. So I wanted to talk about it today, and I wanted to talk about how it's pretty bad on the surface, like the stereotypes, and talk about the community of people that it was using as this native community that the author had never like met, had never been to the region they live in or anything like that, just, you know, picked it for their novel. And yes, you guys might have noticed this isn't my normal setup. I'm actually staying at my girlfriend's for the week, so this is what the next 3 videos will look like probably before I go back to my old set at my old house. Hopefully it's fine. I think it looks okay. I just hope the mic doesn't pick up the computer's fan more because it's closer, but we'll work that out. Let me know in the comments if there's any noticeable difference of anything here. I'm going to plug my social media and Patreon for about a minute. Skip that if you're not interested. But before we get any further, a lot of my work on this channel is demonetized because when you're covering more serious, sometimes edgier topics, YouTube doesn't like this. So if you've ever enjoyed my work, please consider becoming a patron. And you don't have to pledge a crazy amount. I want to build up my Patreon based on as many people as possible, pledging little amounts like $1 or $2. So if you feel like I have ever brought anything that's worthwhile into your life and my content, please really consider becoming a patron to help me continue to do this regardless of if YouTube monetize or not most of my videos in a given month. Also, if you want to join our communities, come check out our Discord and my subreddit. Those links in the description. And if you want to follow me personally, please check out the Kavernacle at Twitter, at Instagram, and also my personal Reddit where you can keep up to date with all my content and what I'm doing. So we're talking about Twilight, obviously, specifically in this video, but I want to talk about native representation in general. Now, the Twilight thing is just like on the surface pretty problematic. That here you have like these European style like aristocrat white vampire types, like the Cullen family and Edward and stuff, and then you have a group of native werewolf type people who go around shirtless and can't control their urges, and that's like a key thing between them, is that the Cullens are these vampires who can control their urges to drink blood by and large, whereas like Jacob and his tribe of werewolves, they often can't control their rage, obviously playing into very, easy to see stereotypes about Europeans and white people being like sophisticated and in control, and native peoples being more like animals, essentially. Like, it's a very easy to see problem. And I guess even just the concept of it is very problematic. I don't know if you could really do it in a non-problematic way unless the people like creating these scenes and storylines are actually from the native community themselves. But like I said, the history of this, goes back decades, and Native Americans have become quite world famous because of their use in some of the most popular types of films coming out of Hollywood, and that is the Western that dominated the late 50s and the early to mid 1960s, where native peoples often featured pretty prominently. The main problem was also that they were nearly universally cast as the villains. Despite them being victims in their struggles with European settlers and American colonialists, they were always depicted as these savages. And obviously that has its roots in extremely racist history. So it feels extra like scummy that these people not only destroyed these people's lives, agriculture, destroyed their way of living, killed millions of them in the pursuit of this manifest destiny that it was Americans and Europeans' God-given right to take over this land and exploit it for essentially capitalism, which is lovely, and then use these native actors in their films in a very problematic way. And it still isn't really much better. I think Twilight is a good example of this stuff. You have stuff like The Revenant, which is made by like Westerners, but I think the depiction of native peoples is a bit better in there because it plays into the film's message, but this is still largely a story about a white guy who puts himself into the native community, the same thing you have with like The Last of the Mohicans. Even though it's about this like English guy played by Daniel Day-Lewis, it's still about a white guy like torn between two worlds. I can't think of too many films centered around different native communities as the protagonist in these stories, which I think is something that needs to be addressed. So Marlon Brando was of course very eccentric, but if you guys don't know about this, he didn't accept his Oscar for his role as Don Corleone in The Godfather Part 1. Instead, a native woman who came from the Apache tribe called Sasheen Littlefeather went on stage and read part of his speech about why he would not accept this Oscar. Now, Marlon Brando actually wrote a larger letter that was later published. I found it online, thankfully. I want to read to you some of it because it shows you this sort of criticism about the depiction of Native Americans and Indigenous people in film is not something new. It's not just for the woke lefties. Marlon Brando was calling this out in 1973, so much so he wouldn't accept his Oscar for The Godfather. So here are some parts of the speech. And Marlon Brando said, "For 200 years, we have said to the Indian people who are fighting for their land, their life, and their families that their right to be free, lay down your arms, my friends, and then we will remain together. Only if you lay down your arms, my friends, can we talk of peace and come to an agreement which will be good for you. When they laid down their arms, we killed them, we lied to them, we cheated them out of their lands, we starved them into signing fraudulent agreements that we called treaties, which we never kept. We turned them into beggars on the continent that gave life for as long as life can remember, and by any interpretation of history, however twisted, we did not do right. We were not lawful, nor were we just in what we did. For them, we do not have to restore these people. We do not have to live up to some agreements because it is given to us by virtue of our power to attack the rights of others, to take their property, to take their lives when they are trying to defend their land and liberty, and to make their virtues a crime and our own vices virtues." So he goes and talk about like why he's bringing this up. So he says, "Perhaps at this moment you are saying to yourself, what the hell has this got to do with the Academy Awards? Why is this woman standing up here, ruining our evening, invading our lives with things that don't concern us, that we don't care about, wasting our time and money, and intruding in our homes?" I think the answer to those unspoken questions is that the motion picture community has been responsible as any for degrading the Indian and making a mockery of his character, describing his as savage, hostile, and evil. It's hard enough for children to grow up in this world when Indian children watch television and they watch films, and when they see their race depicted as they are in films, their minds become injured in ways we can never know. Recently, there have been a few faltering steps to correct this situation, but too faltering and too few. So I, as a member in this profession, do not feel that I can, as a citizen of the US, accept an award here tonight. I think awards in this country are at times inappropriate to be received or given until the condition of the American Indian is drastically altered. I would hope that those who are listening would not look upon this as a rude intrusion, but as an earnest effort to focus attention on an issue that might very well determine whether or not this country has the right to say from this point forward, we believe in the inalienable rights of all people to remain free and independent on lands that have supported their life beyond living memory. So that is one of the most famous actors of all time saying this stuff. So again, this depiction of Native Americans and the problematic aspects of it have been in the American consciousness for a long, long time. So then it shows you how bad it is that the author of the Twilight books and the people who made the film would really play into these depictions. Now, someone actually wrote a really good academic paper about this. I don't know if this is like a university undergrad essay or a postgrad essay, but it's called Misrepresenting the Quileute Nation, an Anti-Imperialist Critique of Stephanie Meyer's Twilight Saga by Ray Elizabeth Harlow, spring 2012, submitted to the Pennsylvania State University Schreier Honors College. Now this is very good. I hope I put a link somewhere in the description, but it has a couple things I want to point out. How Twilight kind of like started bad and got like way worse. So in the introduction, it talks about how she formed this idea for like these werewolf characters and the setting of her book. So it says, in the summer of 2004, author Stephanie Meyer visited Forks, Washington, the setting of her completed but yet to be published novel Twilight for the very first time. Meyer had discovered Forks through a Google search for a setting for a novel, and she created a fictionalized version of the town to serve as a backdrop for her story about the supernatural love triangle by human teenager Bella Swan, vampire Edward Cullen, and Quileute Indian-turned-werewolf shapeshifter Jacob Black. Meyer's trip to Washington soothed her fears about any discrepancies between her version of Forks and the real thing. There were a few small differences, she observed, but otherwise it was eerily similar to my imaginings. Enthralled by the beauty of the nearby First Beach, Meyer gathered a jar full of the beach's rainbow-coloured rocks and took them home, placing them on her desk in the hopes that they would fend off writer's block as she worked on Twilight sequels. Some, after reading Meyer's blog post about her trips to Forks, took their own pilgrimages to the town and filled their own jars of colourful pebbles. Clearly the widespread appeal of Meyer's words give her real power, but she does not wield this responsibly. The Quileute Tribal Council forbids the removal of coloured pebbles from the First Beach, an ordinance of which Meyer was unaware before violating it, and her great influence on her fans convinced them to do the same. Similarly, Meyer's ignorance produced a misrepresentation of the Quileute tribe in her work that has a power to influence young fans and cause real-life consequences for them. Meyer's Quileute tribe, and the character of Jacob Black in particular, were created with no input whatsoever from tribal elders, and these characters are imperialist-oriented stereotypes of Native Americans. Meyer has co-opted and completely fictionalized the Quileute tribal identity and the identity of individual Native characters for her own financial gain, and other institutions have used the same harmful imagery to capitalize on the Twilight saga. So that essay is well worth a read. I'm not going to go into all of it, but it talks about the things I mentioned before, about like the comparisons between Edward Cullen and Jacob as part of this love triangle, how Jacob is always kind of seen as the inferior one, of the depiction in the film and in the book of Jacob and his tribal community, like the poverty versus the, you know, the various luxury of the Cullens and stuff, and just how both of these things really just basically ape stereotypes from back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Now, people are obviously really mad because it shows you straight away she has no cultural sensitivity about this tribe. She barely knows anything about them, but she decides to use them as these werewolf creatures in her books. And although they're depicted as these heroes a lot of the time, again, it just furthers the stereotypes about natives that has been going on for, you know, hundreds of years. Now, the essay did go on to talk about how the tourism generated from these books and films affected this community negatively. So it said, many companies and institutions have developed products and services that have placed such pressure on the Quileute nation. Some involve the physical invasion characteristic of the first stage of imperialism. Unauthorized tour buses full of eager fans frequently drive through the reservation to celebrate the Forks invented holiday, Stephanie Meyer Day. News website MSN filmed video footage of notable Forks locations in 2009. This included footage of cemeteries and graves of esteemed tribal leaders on the reservation, all set to macabre music. According to a tribal spokesperson, Jackie Jacobs, the situation caused an enormous amount of pain and suffering to the Quileute nation as a whole, but especially to the descendants of the chief whose graves were filmed. MSN had acquired permission to film points of interest from the Chamber of Commerce in Forks, but did not realise the Quileute nation was its own sovereign entity, reducing it to a subset of the town of Forks. MSN and various tour bus companies have followed Meyer's example and failed to consult any tribal leaders before manipulating the tribe's image into something they themselves could profit from. Similarly, several companies, including upscale department store chain Nordstrom Inc., developed their own Quileute wolf-themed products such as jewellery and clothing, again without consulting the tribe in any way. So it's not surprising when you treat the issue of this tribe with such a lack of sensitivity and nuance that people will just copy your behaviour and see them no more as like a tourist attraction, as something that is like part of this fictional version of them. But I want to get into Meyer a bit more. Now, in 2018, there was an interview with the director of the first Twilight movie, Catherine Hardwicke, and she told the Daily Beast that Hardwicke wanted a lot more of the cast to be diverse. Hardwicke noted that Meyer had not really written it in that way, so she probably just didn't see the world that way. And I was like, oh my god, I want the vampires. Alice, I wanted her to be Japanese. I had all these ideas, and she just could not accept the Cullens to be more diverse because she had really seen them in her mind. She knew who each character was represented in a way, a personal friend or a relative or something. She said, I wrote that they had this pale, glistening skin. Hardwicke said that Meyer eventually came around to the idea of Kenyan-American actor Eddie Gaffergy playing the character Laurent, but Hardwicke thought it was because he was one of the antagonistic vampires. For this reason, some critics have now picked up the idea that Meyer would only agree to cast a non-white actor if they were a villain. And I actually read another essay about this character and the use of this non-white vampire in Twilight, and essentially how he pretty much is a bad guy for the whole thing and sort of redeems himself at the end. Now, a native actor who played one of Jacob's tribes in the film actually wrote an article for Vice, and he was talking about an Adam Sandler movie, but he does talk about his work on Twilight and why he does it, and I think it's really interesting. So I'm going to read some of it for you now. So this guy is Tyson Houseman, and he says, when I was younger, I acted in some of the Twilight movies. I played a shape-shifting werewolf who was a member of the fictionalized version of the Quileute tribe, a real Native American tribe in Washington. In light of the media coverage that Adam Sandler's newest movie is receiving due to some Native American actors walking off the set, I felt compelled to offer some insight up for public consumption from my own experience as an Indigenous actor who's dealt with racism in the film industry. First of all, I should note I'm fully aware of the Twilight Saga's problematic portrayal of Native Americans and the appropriation of real Quileute myths and traditions into fantasy. I say problematic because these films offer the image of Native Americans basically as mythical creatures, but they are also some of the few Hollywood blockbusters depicting contemporary Native characters, as opposed to fake historic relics of a romanticized early American frontier. He goes on to say, I knew that the character I was playing was problematic, and I still did it because it was a huge opportunity. This problematic portrayal was never discussed on set between actors or writers. It was kind of an elephant in the room. It's easy to take a moral stance on something, but as we all know, it's a lot harder to stand by your morals when they are put to the test, which is why I have nothing but praise for the group of actors who were able to stick to their guns and walk off the set of Sandler's movie. Indigenous actors face struggles of misrepresentation all the time, from typecasting to insensitive and false historical research, and I know from experience that it takes a great deal of courage to stand up to this. Unfortunately, the majority of roles in film and TV for Indigenous actors are for characters like the brave or the savage, one-liner characters that do nothing but add some colour to background shots or get killed when they attack the white protagonist. So obviously that's a really good insight into why native actors often go along with these problematic depictions of native culture, because this guy, I assume he isn't part of the Quileute tribe because he didn't say he was, probably part of another tribe. But it is pretty interchangeable, isn't it, for native actors? Because we as like societies don't really understand the differences between them. Like, I've done my own research because games like Assassin's Creed got me really interested in like the Mohicans, and like popular history and culture makes you want to kind of learn the differences about them. But in terms of media depictions, we aren't really shown much nuance between these groups and how they are different. You really have to go looking for specific documentaries or read specific books about native history to really understand the differences between them. So obviously you heard about the exploitation by like the MSN crew and stuff like that. In terms of generally, this community has experienced a sort of like economic upturn because of, you know, so many fans over the last decade coming to this area, and they've, you know, really played into it as a community, and they've sold a lot of stuff. You know, they've made new food stands and everything named after the books and the movies and everything like that. But a lot of them are quite uncomfortable because on one hand, this has brought greater interest into their history, into their culture. On the other hand, they're being held up for something that they're not, because a lot of the fans believe them to be far more similar to the tribe in the books compared to the real life one. Now, one good thing they are doing is what they've done with this, which is, you know, very good on their part, is they've brought a lot of cultural events to the area for tourists so they can all learn about this tribe, and they have whole things about debunking like the misconceptions from the film, which is really good. And they've even had some of the actors from the film who play the tribe to come in and talk about this stuff for the tourists. So they have been using this stuff for good, but like I said, a lot of them have been uncomfortable because a lot of them obviously don't trust outsiders, and especially when they're so disrespectful, and especially when the author of the book was so disrespectful in the first place and seemingly just chose these people at random, didn't do much history into their culture, and really just made them a stand-in for just a generalized stereotypical native tribe plucked out of 1970s Hollywood. And due to her like hesitancy to add more diversity to the cast in the movie, and how the only like real prominent non-white vampire is really stereotypical and kind of evil as well, a lot of people are saying like she really has a problem and a blind spot with race and just being sensitive in general, which it seems pretty clear from what I've read you. But I guess what I think you should take from this video is just like a lot of these tropes and stereotypes are problematic, and you might think you're talking about Twilight, how ridiculous, this like film for teenagers, who cares if it has a problematic stereotypical depiction of native peoples, a specific native people. Who cares about that? It's dumb. Why are you critiquing movies? But it's part of a wider problem, right? These stereotypes go back hundreds of years, and they've been prominent for a long time. And like I said, I haven't seen many high-budget, mainstream films that really have native tribes take on a key part of the plot or features their story prominently. I'm sure there's a couple out there, probably more indie films, but even something like The Revenant, which does deal with native issues, is inspired by things like climate change and stuff like that. It still has a white guy who goes into the native culture, and that's how the native story is told, just like Last of the Mohicans and various other films. Although it might not be the traditional white savior, it often is these white characters and their families helping to save these tribes rather than the tribes having their own agency. And the way we often think about stuff like this is influenced by films, TV and movies and books. And it's part of like a broader thing you see, and it's subconscious in your mind and how you see these people, because it's important to deprogram yourself from more bigoted views on different races and ethnicity. It's important to broaden your horizon, read more, watch more, learn more. But if you as a society are a casual consumer of stuff, you watch Twilight and it just reaffirms probably some ingrained prejudices you have about people like Native Americans and various Indigenous people, and that's the problem. And of course, you know, it's not just relegated to Native Americans, it's also, of course, for African Americans, often Asians as well. I talked about the cyberpunk genre and Orientalism. So there's lots of stuff to unpack here. And the main thing to take away from it, I can already see some comments. You are not a bad person if you like Twilight the film. You are not a bad person if you like Twilight the books. You can enjoy problematic media, but it's just important to have these conversations on where they're problematic, where they fail, and where they stereotype to the detriment of people who are often largely voiceless in the entertainment industry. And despite natives being prominent in Hollywood, they are often voiceless because they aren't the leading actors, they aren't the directors, they aren't the stars. They often have just been used as a convenient villain for Western movies. And that's kind of like what Edward Said's Orientalism is always about, is like the story of his people is told to you by people who aren't them. It's told to you by European colonialists. It's told to you by American colonialists. It's not told to you by the native peoples themselves. So you're always getting a stereotypical, skewed and often completely false view of these people. But that becomes the knowledge, and that's what Edward Said talked about. The power and knowledge. The power gives you the ability to spread the knowledge. Twilight film is very popular. You have the power. It's spreading the knowledge of this one tribe and spreading the knowledge of them to millions of people, depicting them in a very stereotypical native way for Hollywood, and also mischaracterizing their beliefs and stuff. Anyway, let me know what you guys think down in the comments. I enjoyed making this video, very interesting to research all this stuff. If you want to follow me on social media, at the Kavernacle on Twitter and Instagram. If you want to join our communities, Discord and our subreddit, and that stuff is all in the description. If you want to support me on Patreon, check that out as well. And if you made it this far, thank you all for watching.